All right. Well, I'm here today to talk a little bit about musicians, and particularly musicians as the original gig workers, which is something we like to point out in music studies. This is where the term gig comes from, is what jazz instrumentalists and singers used to refer to their jobs. Now, we've seen a lot of different ways that this work has changed. Like obviously musical work has historically been defined by precarity, high levels of competition. It's also very highly skilled, and a lot of soft skills, affective labor and charisma come into play as well. Now, in the past 25 years, we've seen significant changes in the field of and what it's like to make money as a musician, especially because of the impact of the digital economy. So we've had a lot of research, for example, on the impact of streaming on musical income. You're going from being able to sell CDs, even if you're a small-time musician, you can sell a CD at a gig, to getting fractions of a penny per stream. So this is no longer a reasonable way for most musicians to make a reasonable income. So there's been a real move to live performance, even for those people who would historically have made money through the recording process. And then, of course, on top of this, we had the pandemic descending, and that was terrible and decimating for many live music performers. So in this economy, there's been a lot of shifts in the past 20 years. But one thing that has been overlooked by a lot of the scholarship is looking at the impact of caregiving, parenting, mothering, and caring for elders in this group. And for Kat and me, we are both musicians. Kat remains an active performer, and we're both moms. And this has struck us as a significant oversight. And so what we're presenting today is very preliminary findings, like we just closed our survey a few weeks ago on what it looks like to be a musician caregiver in Canada. And so I want to start by just kind of looking a little bit at some of the discursive framing that has influenced this. And this really brings us to two guiding beliefs that have guided our work, that music is labor and caregiving is work, or vice versa. Now, because both of these have often been framed as avocations, music is something that you do for love, it's often very hard to frame it as work and acknowledge that labor that's involved, and also to advocate for fair compensation. And of course, we know that there's an extensive literature that shows this is also true for caregiving and mothering, that it's instinctive, it's natural, it's something that, again, makes it really hard to advocate for adequate support. Now, the other factor that's in play is that until very recently, music studies very broadly has not really taken topics like motherhood and caregiving into consideration. And so part of this has been beginning to change in the field in historical work, but there's still a growing amount of work to be done in more contemporary performance. And when we do think about this, because we often focus on celebrity in our society, especially in popular music studies, which is kind of where I live, we're often focusing on superstars like, Beyonce. We love Beyonce, and we love her children and the way that they play into her work. But of course, most working musicians do not have superstar support teams. And in fact, when we think about that role of affording childcare and having access, we're looking at a population that has a very wide range of income and experience, but according to a 2016 study that was funded by the Canada Council and Ontario Arts Council, we are looking at less than $18,000 a year that was made by the typical musician. So this makes childcare something that is very hard to access. So, to better understand this, we designed a preliminary study, which was open for around 8 weeks, or 8 months, I should say, and we used self-identification as our main way of gaining participants. This is because defining a professional musician is fraught. If you define it by, where you work, by how many hours you work, by your income, you're going to cut a lot of people out who had actually identified that way. We wanted to hear from a very wide range of people. Also, we wanted to be very inclusive in the way that we're defining caregivers. So we wanted to hear from people of all genders. We wanted to hear from people who are involved in not just parenting, but also caring for elders. And so we got a bunch of survey responses. We got 54 who completed the quantitative portion of the survey, and 9 who only partially completed that quantitative part, but we had 45 fully complete surveys, which showed a really high level of engagement. And so in our remaining time, we want to share some of our initial key findings from what people were saying about who they were, the challenges that they have faced, and how they can be better supported. And so I'll turn it over to just a very high-level survey of our participant demographics and the professional information, and then I'll pass it over to Kat, who will talk about the caregiving piece of this. So our participants, the typical one would be a white woman, cis, straight, heterosexual, living in a large city in Canada. That said, we kind of checked our survey responses against sort of larger demographic trends, and it was pretty representative-ish about in terms of ethnicity and in terms of sexual orientation, but non-Anglophones. I think, interestingly, people under 30, we didn't have any respondents in that category, and I think we can have some guesses about people waiting to have children, and disabled folks were underrepresented. I think it makes a lot of sense that we were hearing from people in large urban areas and suburbs. And then we were really pleased to get 21 out of those 54 respondents were men. 2 were gender fluid. So we would expect to have a fairly large number of women responding, but we had a very solid representation from folks other than women. Now, professionally, we really lean in. This probably has something to do with the networks that, that we have, but we had a very high representation of vocalists as well as string players, especially orchestral string players, but also folks who played bass guitar and guitar. We also had some folks who were keyboardists, a conductor, and some percussionists. The genres that they played, I think, covered a pretty wide range. So classical and jazz dominated, but we also had pop, rock, alternative, blues, folk. So a pretty wide range, and a lot of people cut between different musical genres as well. And this played out in the kinds of gigs that they did. So we had a lot of people who were doing more artist kind of gigs, in other words, performing at festivals, performing at concerts. But then we also had a range of people who were performing and jobbing. So that would be people providing music for restaurants or bars or other kinds of entertainment, sort of more in the background, or for your weddings. But as you can tell, a really large number of different kinds of work that people were doing. Now, this is one of the things I think that will show why it's so challenging to make generalizations about musicians as a group. It's not just what they play and where they play, but also the income. And we had people ranging from income under $5,000 in 2022 and 2023 to over $100,000. So this covers a really broad range of things. Now, especially for those folks whose income from performance was on the lower end, unsurprisingly, only 7 people earn their living solely from performance. Most of them supplemented with teaching, universities, colleges, public schools, and a lot of private lesson teachers as well. There were also a lot of people who also worked in different kinds of music work, as well as people who were working, in non-musical self-employment. So again, what this means is that we're dealing with people who have a very low average income, but again, actually not average, median income. That's important because averaging you would blow out the numbers, of course, with really high incomes. And so this leaves us with a kind of a picture of a very diverse workforce in terms of income and location, but then the impact of childcare.
All right, so what did our respondents' caregiving responsibilities look like? Well, most had 1 or 2 children, and 20% reported caregiving for adults as well. Caring for elders could be quite demanding, and a lot of participants reported doing things like helping manage their medical care, finances, doing groceries, as well as regular visits and moral support. On the other end of the spectrum, many of the respondents had very young children. So 21 had toddlers, 28 had young school-age children under the age of 10, and happily, many respondents had family support. Now, 87% of our respondents reported sharing caregiving responsibilities with their spouse. This aligns with the 2021 Canadian Census numbers that show around 16% of children live in single-parent families. So having a partner enabled many respondents to take time off after their child or children were born, including most of the male-identified respondents. But several musician caregivers also took on work when their children were really young to help defray some of their family's expenses. One of our most striking findings was how parents of young children handled childcare. Though many participants have kids below kindergarten age, less than 20% use full or part-time daycare, and only 16% use babysitters. Many respondents reported that their children's grandparents provided significant and unpaid childcare support. The limited use of daycare makes sense to us. Most daycares are open during the traditional 9 to 5 working hours, which aligns very poorly with musicians' evening and weekend work schedules. So some of these challenges became easier as children got older and went to school. But for many musicians, this also coincided with the time when their parents needed active support. So the unconventional childcare support necessitated a great deal of juggling and negotiations with the musician's spouse and, of course, with their parents too. And the challenges and career impacts could start as soon as a child was born, even for those with what they refer to as breadwinner partners. So this person said here, when we asked how much time they took off after having a child and what type of financial support they had, they said, "My partner is the main breadwinner for the home. I took 2 maternity leaves as well as keeping a job in order to cover costs, which then in turn inhibited me from being able to pursue more music." As a result, most musicians reported becoming more selective about the gigs they took. One respondent wrote, "Now that my husband and I are freelance," he's also a musician, "we have to calculate with every gig if it's worth it to pay for childcare if we're both working at the same time. We often try not to do gigs at the same time because it will deplete more earnings than it's worth." Touring was particularly difficult for parents, and many reported sharply reducing the frequency and length of their tours. As one father reported, "Every decision to tour requires an extreme amount of coordination, sacrifice, and negotiation." The central challenge for these musician caregivers is rooted in the fact that time is money. A lack of affordable and accessible childcare makes scheduling gigs and rehearsals, not to mention touring, a persistent challenge, while also limiting time for practicing, creative development, and promotional work, which are all very crucial to this career. Over time, our respondents, particularly women, reported career delays. As one woman wrote, "Please find women touring artists 40 plus with kids who have robust performance careers, and I think we'll find that the opportunities for that demographic are extremely limited." Our respondents also described significant rewards, however, for combining children with a musical career. Time is invaluable. They got to spend more time with their children than other parents who are working 9 to 5 jobs. And their children were exposed to music making by staying local. They were more engaged with their communities, and they experienced boosts to their creativity as artists. As one mother wrote, "I learned a lot about caring for another person. I am able to immerse my child in an artistic, creative environment. Parenting has enriched my life, and this has strongly affected my songwriting in a positive way." So, what would help musician caregivers? Our respondents identified 2 major areas for improvement. 1, more support in arts grants, and 2, more affordable childcare. So I'll speak to number 1 first. Instead of granting bodies making childcare a claimable part of the total grant amount, which is pretty typical for a lot of our granting bodies, there could be an additional fund for childcare so that parents can use their grant money fully for the art itself, just like non-parents. And one model is Women in Music Canada. And they introduced recently some micro childcare grants for women musicians. But as our study shows, men and male identifying musicians could also benefit from this support. And to go to number 2, we could also increase the availability of affordable childcare and have some of it available for evenings and weekends. This would additionally benefit other arts workers, not just musicians, as well as people like nurses, retail workers, restaurant and transit workers, and many other workers in the gig economy. So to conclude, our research is still in its early stages, but looking ahead, we will continue to explore the diversity of musician caregiver experiences using interviews and other methods. We also want to account for what we came to see as the central bias of this study, and that is its inclusion of only those who currently identify as being both musicians and caregivers. We do believe that there are valuable insights to be gained from musicians who have deferred parenthood and from caregivers who were unable to sustain their musical careers, because that is a big part of the picture here. Instead, our respondents may well be the exceptions. rather than the rule. Finally, we need to look at musician caregivers in context in relation to other arts workers, as well as those in precarious and irregular employment. So in relation to Canada's policy environment for workers as well, parents and the arts, and we need to identify community-based strategies for supporting musician caregivers. If we are to have a sustainable music culture for everyone, you shouldn't need superstar wealth and staff to have a music career and children as well. Thank you.